Welcome to Wider View, a program that provides perspectives on the news outside the narrow confines of the mainstream media. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. I'm happy to welcome Walter Hixson back to Wider View today. Dr. Hixson spent 4 decades in academic life, culminating in a role as Distinguished Professor of History at the University of Akron. He's written a number of books on U.S. foreign policy, and his last 2 books have been on the Israel lobby. The latest is Architects of Repression: How Israel and its Lobby Put Racism, Violence, and Injustice at the Center of U.S. Middle East Policy. So you've written a number of books on U.S. foreign policy, but your last 2 books have been on the Israel lobby. How did you come to focus on the Israel lobby, and why did you think it was so important?
I wasn't a specialist in the Middle East. For a long time, I was a historian focused on the Cold War.
Right.
So when I did turn to the Middle East amid all the conflicts in this century, and then began to dig deeply into it, I had a lot of naive assumptions that I think a lot of people have, that this was some kind of deep-seated historic conflict, that both sides bore a lot of responsibility, and it's really not that at all. It's a settler colonial conflict in which European colonizers really are at the root of the conflict and caused the conflict. Mm-hmm. So then I had to ask myself, why is it, I had these misunderstandings and so many other people did about Israel, and not really being fully aware of Israel's what I call congenital aggression throughout the history of the Palestine issue. So in understanding why Americans didn't grasp that takes you to the lobby, because the lobby plays the role of disinformation and of obscuring Israel's role in the conflict. So that's how I got interested in the lobby, and then things just evolved from there. Yeah.
Well, you did a book, I think back in 2013, on American settler colonialism, and I know you referred to settler colonialism in your new book, which, by the way, is called Architects of Repression: How Israel and its Lobby Put Racism, Violence, and Injustice at the Center of U.S. Middle East Policy. But maybe you can talk a little bit about settler colonialism. What are the characteristics, and how has that impacted the relationship between Israel and the U.S., for example?
The term has been used a lot now lately in the last, 5 or 6 years, and rightfully so. It's sort of a double-edged sword. On the one thing, there are things very unique about Zionism, obviously, the Nazi genocide, and also one aspect that I emphasize in this, in Architects of Repression, is the timing of Zionist settler colonialism. And that's really important. So, the timing is one of the essential differences between the U.S. or Canadian or Australian and Israeli settler colonialism. And so by the time Israeli settler colonialism, which is premised on, this is the basic notion of settler colonialism, it's premised on the notion of removal or elimination of the indigenous population. It doesn't mean they have to be all slaughtered, but it does invariably involve ethnic cleansing and massacres, and that certainly has happened in the so-called Middle East or West Asia. But the timing is very important, because by the time Israeli settler colonialism and Zionism takes hold, you've got the United Nations, you've got recognition of the rights of indigenous people, you've got the UN Declaration of Human Rights, you've got a whole wave of decolonization unfolding in the world precisely at the time that Israel is colonizing. And so it's a settler colonial conflict, but the lobby's role then is to obscure that and to make Israel the victim, being surrounded by fanatical Arabs, who want to drive it into the sea, etc. Because to really acknowledge the settler colonial situation does not shed a positive light on Israel.
I think the other thing that we have to say, of course, is settler colonialism, because of the ethnic cleansing, is inherently racist and inherently aggressive. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's premised on the idea that you can legitimately remove these people because they're not special, they're not chosen, like you are. And obviously, that entails racial assumptions. These are dark-skinned, inferior, developing third world people. So the real irony and the real challenge for Israel and the lobby, which they met in spades, was to overcome precisely that era when these things are being recognized, that no, indigenous people are, other human beings, and racism apartheid is unacceptable. But it has been, obviously, it was inherent and intrinsic to the settler colonial project in Israel. You're absolutely right about that.
Yeah, you begin, I think, your book with some history, really, of the lobby and in the U.S. And I think many people would be surprised how early we had Zionist influence on the U.S. government. I mean, you talk about in 1918 when the Zionist Organization of America convinced President Wilson to support the Balfour Declaration. This is obviously, certainly in 1918, a very small minority, and a minority that at that point was widely discriminated against in the U.S. How did they get so powerful that they were able to convince the president, sit down with the president and convince him to do something?
Yeah, well, you're right. It is deeply rooted and goes back not just with the president, but especially, of course, the Congress, back to the World War I period, but really takes off after World War II. So although Jews are a distinct minority, they've always been a very influential minority, particularly in the East Coast, particularly in New York, was basically the capital of world Jewry. And remember, a lot of people aren't aware, first of all, of just what a small country Israel is, which points to the real irony of it receiving more American financial assistance than any other country in world history. It's just a small country of 9 million people. But a lot of people aren't aware that the largest Jewish population in the world was in the United States up until the post-war period. So a lot of Jews were concentrated in powerful positions and influential positions. And to their credit, they were very well organized, very determined. And then, of course, by the time the Nazi genocide set in, who can blame them for being determined and for seeking alternatives? And they were just very effective and very well organized and very well ensconced, financially and in academia and in urban environments, and put together an incredibly effective lobby.
Yeah, and very early on, convincing the U.S. to go along with the Balfour Declaration, and also there's, the U.S. entered the World War I on the British side, soon after that fact. That's very important to our history as well as to theirs.
Yeah, that was a foundation. And then, with what happened in the 1930s and then the post-war period, it really took off. Absolutely.
Yeah. There's a lot of mythology, I think, about the establishment of the State of Israel, just as we have our own mythology about, I didn't learn anything about settler colonialism in school. But can you talk a little bit about the establishment of the State of Israel, the lobby, the Truman administration, and how that all went down?
Yeah, it really began with their strong desire to find a home for refugees, Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany and from the war in Europe. Of course, the whole world was teeming with refugees at the end of World War II. But the outreach to Congress and to the Truman administration was first $100,000, doesn't sound like much today, $100,000 proposal for Jewish refugees, and it grew from there. And so in seeking that funding to bring Jewish refugees to the United States and to fund them then to go to Israel, they organized the lobby. A key figure I dealt with in my first book, Israel's Armor, was Isaiah Leo Kennan. But there were many other Zionist leaders, including Abba Hillel Silver from Northeast Ohio, from Cleveland, very influential rabbi. And a turning point was the Biltmore Conference in 1942 in New York. And then in the 1944 elections, the lobby It's not even the Israel lobby yet. No, Israel, it's the Zionist lobby.
Mm-hmm.
But the Zionist lobby found that they could be very effective in congressional and presidential campaign in lining up support or threatening to withhold support from candidates. And it really took off from there. From the 1944 elections, that was like the light bulb going off to Zionist lobby leaders that we could play a role in A, getting money from Congress, and B, deciding who serves in Congress.
Mm-hmm.
And their tactics for doing that, writing letters to constituents, demonstrations, etc., they all really took off at about that time in the mid-40s, much earlier than most people think.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the lobbies had explosive growth since, but it was already ensconced before Israel was created.
That's one of the things that I think was so important about your book and about your previous book, Israel's Armor, as well, as getting that history down, because I think we tend not to understand that. But, one of the things that puzzles me a great deal about that particular period, that post-war period in history, is the U.S. was instrumental in establishing the new international order, the United Nations Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Geneva Conventions on, and all the other things. But then we were also instrumental in getting the votes in the General Assembly on what was a non-binding resolution recommending creation of a Jewish state in Palestine, which they used as a justification. It's like, on the one hand, we're pushing the United Nations, which is really a way in which formerly colonial possessions were getting recognized, and then we're creating another colony. It's
a really good observation on your part, and it gets it's just the stuff of history, Charles.
Mm-hmm.
This is the stuff of history: contradictions, complexity. That you would think that, yes, the country that had, was the primary sponsor of the UN, which stood for decolonization, rights of indigenous people, a new era of human rights. Remember also, and back to our conversation about settler colonialism, the United States was essentially an apartheid nation itself at that time. It had rigid racial segregation. And so the United States embodied those contradictions, outside of Zionism in its own racial practices. And of course, we still have problems today, to say the least.
Oh, yes.
So it's an ongoing, struggle. But there is a contradiction there that you identify, and that we frequently find this in historical situations. It doesn't mean that people, Eleanor Roosevelt was perfectly sincere about rights for indigenous people and Declaration of Human Rights, but she was also a very staunch Zionist. And if you look at, obviously, what had happened to Jews in Europe under the Nazi regime, it's certainly understandable why they would be able to build on widespread sympathy to support this idea of a Jewish commonwealth, as they called it. But for the people of Palestine, it brought the Nakba, and it brought a human tragedy. And it's completely unjust and was violent and repressive, and also a source of mendacious, storytelling and narrative, as you pointed out, about what actually happened.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is one of the things too with the UN, and I think that was one of our first attempts at arm twisting other nations within the UN and trying to get the UN to do something that we wanted. But it also seems to me to be like a key element in our sort of disaffection with the UN. I mean, we created in 45, 46. And then, we now, it's anathema, we don't pay attention to them. We veto things in the Security Council and so forth.
Right.
Do you think that the lobby was at least partially responsible for that wedge between us and the UN?
Yeah, partially. But in some of my other work on U.S. foreign policy, there was a lot, back to what we were just discussing, there was a lot of concern, even by professional diplomats in the State Department, And they, by the way, were people who were very critical and much more balanced in their attitude about Zionism than the rest of the government. The State Department tried to rein in Zionist aggression, but failed. At the same time, many State Department diplomats had racial prejudice. Some had anti-Semitic prejudice, not virulent, but certainly there were stereotypical negative attitudes about Jews. But apropos your question about the UN, there was great concern that if you let all these dark-skinned people all over the world, Asia, Africa, Latin America, really run the world, then the great powers wouldn't be running the world. So there was always this tension, and the tension is manifested obviously in the difference between the Security Council and the General Assembly in the UN. But the United States has not. It's really, I think, badly compromised the UN and not allowed it to achieve its potential in what you have described, by manipulating and vetoing and not following its tenets. But no country, I would say, since 1947 has been more hostile to the UN than Israel. Once Israel got created through the partition, it had no further use for the United Nations, and no wonder, because the UN called attention to illegal attempts to take over Jerusalem, to ignoring the plight of refugees, to borderland aggression, to massacres like Gibeah massacre in 1953, on and on. So the UN to settlements today has been a source of criticism, and the Israelis have utter disdain for the UN. And because of the lobby, that's something the United States, to answer your question, yes, goes along with in part because of pressure from Israel and its lobby.
Sure, yeah. And you mentioned, too, the State Department, particularly initially under Truman and Eisenhower, and Kennedy also, for that matter, opposed a lot of the U.S. support for the State of Israel. They didn't think it was really in the interest of the United States to go along with what Israel was doing. But the lobby, it seems, rendered the president out powerless, more or less, to shape Middle East diplomacy. How did they do that?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the more compelling, undertold stories in American foreign policy history, I think. And it's terribly important and poignant. Particularly look at the disastrous Middle East policy the United States has had really for a long time. But it's a fascinating story that the State Department, in part because they understood the importance of Arab oil and not alienating Arabs, called for a more balanced diplomacy in the region. And they understood that Israel was, as I call it, congenitally aggressive and was not willing to abide by, reasonable international accords on various matters like Jerusalem or like nuclear weapons, which, of course, Israel cultivated while lying to its special ally right up and down the line. So one of the most intriguing individuals was a diplomat named Robert Comer, Komer, who's pretty well known for being one of the Hawks advisors that brought on Vietnam, but he's less well known and very interesting because he was a State Department advisor to Kennedy and Johnson, and he's Jewish, and he was friends with with Israeli diplomats and members of the Israel lobby, but he implored them to be more compromising. And at one point he threw up his arms and said, "What kind of relationship is this?" Because basically Israel and the lobby just got everything they wanted in American culture and American society. And that's really been the story, except for a couple of fairly often exaggerated and inconsequential defeats, such as the AWACS to Saudi Arabia, which really just enabled Israel to get more and more weaponry itself. Right. The lobby has had its way with the U.S. Congress, and as you mentioned, with most presidents. A few presidents who've been willing to stand up to it. Eisenhower could do it in a limited way. George H.W. Bush paid a price for doing it. Right. Carter got nowhere trying to do it. So Obama was treated just contemptuously by Israel and the lobby and by Netanyahu. So yeah, it's an appalling story, and it to me is a perversion of our democracy.
Mm-hmm.
That this foreign nation of only 9 million people, 7,000 miles from the United States, which today is perfectly secure. Israel has nothing to worry about. It is a military powerhouse. It's a tiny little country, but one of the most powerful in the world. And it goes about bombing and willy-nilly assassinating and, has the United States behind it. So there's no reason for this other than this powerful lobby. There's certainly some lingering sympathy going back to the Nazi genocide and to this depiction of Israel as a lone little democracy, and to the biblical aspects that mean so much to Christian Zionists. But as a practical policy matter, it's an extremely warped and destructive foreign policy that we have.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned Christian Zionists. I was just about to go there because, I mean, the power of the lobby, although it's generated and sustained a lot through the Jewish community in the United States, is also has a great deal of power within the Christian community, with the Christian Zionists, most of whom are on the more conservative side of Christianity. Maybe we can talk a little bit about how that group, what they're about, and how they got into this.
Well, the United States is not only the heartland of Zionism that had the largest Jewish population in the world for a long time. It's the heartland of Christian Zionism. And, fundamentalist religion is very deeply rooted in American culture, going back to what historians call the First Great Awakening, even before the creation of the United States, back in the 1750s. Then there was a Second Great Awakening, and there have been these periodic sort of revivals. And as we know, fundamentalism is a very strong force in this country. In thinking about it in terms of the lobby, I think it's useful to think of the lobby in a couple of different ways. One is the formal lobby that generates money to use politically, and that's AIPAC and its allied many, too many to count, in local, state, and national level organizations, which are predominantly Jewish and predominantly raise the money. But the other way to think about Israeli influence and lobby influence is building upon what I call a cultural foundation. And that includes religion and Christian Zionism. It also includes the shared, quote unquote, frontier history or settler colonial past of having to vanquish, inferior savage enemies out to destroy you, etc. All of that is in American history, and it's in Israeli sort of mythology as well as history. As you point out, a lot of this is not history, it's mythology. So I think Christian Zionism is important. It provides a ballast that the formal lobby can build on, but they work together. And of course, AIPAC has recognized this, and it has actively courted Christian Zionists and encouraged them and brought them into the fold. So it's a kind of a two-pronged attack in that way.
Yeah.
And allows them to appeal beyond a Jewish constituency to a much larger Protestant constituency.
It's based, I think, theologically on this idea that the second coming of Christ is requiring the Jews to go back to Israel and there to be a great battle and all of this. It's a lot of the things that have become very current within fundamentalist Christian thought these days.
Right. And as you know, I added an appendix to the Architects of Repression book. I thought this was an important enough issue for me to investigate as a historian. And while I'm not a specialist on ancient history or the Bible, I did a considerable amount of reading. And there are other works that go into it in much more depth, such as The Invention of the Jewish People is one important title. And there are many others that I cite in that appendix, but suffice it to say that this is not history. It's biblical mythology. Certainly, Jews and Israelites existed in biblical times, or Israelites, which later became called Yehudim and then Jews, existed. But the biblical narrative is a mythological narrative and not although Israel and the lobby attempt to use it quite often to justify their presence and their actions, it doesn't hold water historically. Moreover, some have argued that the stories themselves are horrifically violent anyway.
Oh, absolutely.
And are stories of ethnic cleansing and massacres that you might not want to adopt. Either way, it's very problematic to use the Bible to justify what's been done in Palestine. Basically, the way AIPAC operates is it lets you know it's there when you arrive, the day you arrive in Congress. They then try to get you on a junket to Israel. It's a nice first-class air flight, $10,000 trip. Who's going to turn it down? And the AIPAC lobby representatives come around. They let you know when a vote is meaningful to AIPAC. They offer you tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars to your campaign. This is not AIPAC directly necessarily. AIPAC just decides who gets it. And the flip side of that is if you don't do what they want and don't take it, they can offer that to your opponent.
Sure.
So it's really, let's say it's $200,000. Well, you might as well double it. It's a $400,000 swing. You either get 200 or your opponent gets 200. They do other things. They write letters to constituents. They have demonstrations. They have a whole panoply and variety of attacks. There's any effective lobby has, whether it's the gun, pharmaceutical, or retired persons. And they're very, very good at it, very, very skilled at it, very heavily resourced. They continue to add resources. But you're perfectly right. They have targeted and defeated critics. On the other hand, particularly in 2020, a couple of, namely Elliot Engel of New York and a couple of their longtime pro-Israeli stalwarts were defeated, even though they were massively funded by the lobby. And so it doesn't always work, but certainly I think everybody in Congress lives in fear of AIPAC, and that's a sad situation.
Yeah, it really is. It struck me that also that maybe, that the influence of the lobby on American politics is pervasive and probably a great deal deeper than most of us think about in terms of what has changed, about the way we do business. I mean, the relationship between the executive and the legislative branch, for example, keep seeing Congress at the lobby's behest getting involved in foreign policy and deciding that this or that nation should be sanctioned and the president should not be allowed to do X, which changed the whole dynamic of the government.
Absolutely. I mean, they intrude directly and heavily. And going back to the State Department, where it began, they identified the State Department as a threat because these diplomats were doing their jobs, which is reporting from the Middle East on what was actually happening on the ground. And they were reporting aggressive actions that were extra legal and outside of international law and unjust and violent and racist. So the lobby first attacked the State Department. Then it would target presidents like Eisenhower who tried to rein them in. And by the time you got to Johnson, for example, he was completely caved into the lobby, anything they wanted. And of course, Trump is the ultimate manifestation of that as well. So, they have punished presidents who stand in their way, but it's really Congress that has controlled the first purse strings, where the lobby is really ensconced and really effective. And we're seeing some, as I just indicated, some cracks in the monolith. And you've also got, I think, very importantly, liberal Jews who are fed up with Netanyahu and the Israeli right wing, including their contempt that you just talked about in your question for American institutions, whether it's the presidency or the Congress. I mean, what they did to Obama with Netanyahu being invited by the Congress to speak to a joint session of Congress without the president even knowing about it, to oppose the president's foreign policy in the Iran nuclear treaty, which every other country in the world of any significance supported. I mean, it's just appalling. And that's what goes on. And it is contemptuous of American institutions. It's also contemptuous of American freedom of speech. Now, if you say these things, you can be accused of anti-Semitism or you can be blocked from Facebook, So they don't care about anything except getting the funding for Israel and appeasing Israeli aggression. It needs to be changed.
Yeah. Well, I think we should end on a little bit more positive note, which is maybe where you can see some of the cracks in the Israel's armor at this point, and what people can do, people who might be listening to this can do to help those cracks get wider.
Yeah, well, I think the cracks are despite Israel's disdain for the UN, there's still a lot of international opposition and pressure. The Palestinians have been incredibly determined, despite the oppression and repression they've suffered, and remain active. Again, I think it's very important that liberal Jewish groups, even ones that are conflicted and confused, like J Street, which is sort of, halfway challenging AIPAC, but on the other hand is very Zionist organization. It doesn't want to limit funding to Israel, but at the same time, it does oppose the illegal settlements and supports things like Betty McCollum's powerful bill to not have American funding go to contribute to the undermining the lives of Palestinian children. Of course, AIPAC opposes that. So there's still a lot of international pressure from the BDS movement, even though they've fought back and attacked freedom of speech and used lawfare and all sorts of tactics like Canary Mission, which are just beyond the pale and really just horrific tactics to smear people who oppose Israel in the lobby. Nonetheless, I think J Street's a good example of the progress that is being made. The Democratic mainstream, while Biden and Nancy Pelosi and centrist Democrats are still basically in AIPAC's pocket and will do what AIPAC wants, the masses, if you will, of Democrats, polls have shown, do want to condition aid to Israel on stopping its expansion and forcing it out of the occupied territories, and certainly not to be able to absorb the West Bank and do the kind of cleansing operations that are going on in East Jerusalem, even as we speak. So polls show that mainstream Democrats want to make aid conditional. So what can people do? They need to do what the lobby does. They need to contact their congressman and tell them how they feel about this $3.8 billion going annually to a country that doesn't need it, when other countries and even our own country obviously do need it. So it's misappropriation of funds. It's support for racism. My goodness, with the Black Lives Matter movement, now is the time to exploit the drive for racial justice, to point out, you can't, like Cory Booker does, go before Congress and speak passionately about how you deplore racism in America and then go support it on the ground in Palestine. Yeah. And so these contradictions have to be pointed out and publicized, and they're vulnerable on these points because it is a racist society. In 2018, Israel formally made itself a Jewish state with Hebrew as the official language. That means 20% of the population of Palestinians are automatically second-class citizens. They already were, but now they've made it legal. This is an apartheid state. It's an apartheid state from the river to the sea, and they are vulnerable on that point. And, with a racist leadership like Netanyahu. So a lot of American Jews, particularly in really effective organizations, beyond J Street, which is very, very moderate, but Jewish Voice for Peace, for example, very assertive organization. We've now had the Israeli human rights group, B'Tselem, come out and say Israel's an apartheid state. Carnegie Report, has called for human rights-based approach to Israeli policy. So it's picking up, and I think things are happening. And it's at a certain point, lies are just too big to stand on their own. And I think the AIPAC is going to run into that. But make no mistake, Charles, they are gearing up. They have a lot of money. They've raised tons of money, even though a longtime donor, Adelson, died. His wife's still around. I'm sure she's still giving them a lot of money. Their headquarters has grown. They're doubling the number of personnel. So this is a very determined lobby, and they're used to winning. They won't go away, but they are vulnerable.
Well, I hope you're right. I think you're right. But people have to keep chipping away. I think we have to keep pushing our Congress in the other direction. Good.
Yep.
Well, I thank you for coming on the program. On that podcast site, I will provide links to your website, to the book.
Oh, great.
And maybe to a few of the other things that we've been discussing in the last few minutes here. Thanks very much, Walter. Appreciate it.
Keep up your great work.
All right. I keep trying. Thank you. You've been listening to Dr. Walter Hixson, author of the new book, Architects of Repression, How Israel and its Lobby Put Racism, Violence, and Injustice at the Center of U.S. Middle East Policy. You can find links to this book and Dr. Hixson's website at widerviewradio.podbean.com. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Thanks for listening to Wider View.